In 1951, if you asked an American rider which British motorcycle stood for speed, craftsmanship, and national pride, many would have answered with a single word: Norton. The company had already claimed victories at the Isle of Man and built a reputation that stretched far beyond Britain's shores. Its machines were not only race winners, but symbols of a country that believed it still led the mechanical world. For decades, Norton refined the same engine architecture, perfecting balance, torque, and handling while competitors chased novelty. It looked unshakable, yet within a generation, ownership changes, industrial hesitation, and shifting global economics began to erode that confidence. This is the story of how a racing empire became financially fragile, how nostalgia later replaced production strength, and how a legendary name struggled to survive a marketplace that rewarded scale over sentiment. So how did a national icon lose control of its own destiny? Maine. For Britain, Norton became more than a manufacturer. It became a symbol. The Isle of Man TT was not just another race, it was a national stage. When Norton riders crossed the finish line ahead of continental competitors, it reinforced a quiet belief that British engineering was still at the center of the mechanical world. Alongside BSA and Triumph, Norton represented a generation that had survived war and returned to competition. The racing paddock became a place where national pride mixed with oil and hot metal. Riders carried spare push rods in their boots. Mechanics tuned engines by feel and experience. The machines were simple, but the ambition behind them was not. When the company introduced the Featherbed frame in 1951, developed through real experimentation in stiffness and geometry, it changed how motorcycles handled at speed. Riders described it as steady and planted, as if the machine finally understood the road. The frame alone became part of British folklore. What could possibly threaten a name that had survived wars, dominated the Isle of Man, and defined an era of British racing excellence? The answer begins with the same discipline that built the legend. Norton believed in refinement. It believed that if an engine worked, it could be perfected. The company did not jump toward radical change when it saw rising engine speeds in the 1920s and 1930s. Instead, it improved valve timing. It studied airflow. It experimented with bronze cylinder heads to manage heat. It adopted overhead camshaft designs when needed, but it always returned to the idea that balance and control mattered more than spectacle. This philosophy produced machines that delivered strong torque as in the range riders actually used. It produced ignition timing that required less advance than many competitors, which meant more efficient combustion and less wasted heat. It produced engines that felt complete rather than fragile. However, while engineers refined combustion chambers and frame geometry, the company's management culture did not evolve at the same pace. Manufacturing remained informal. Production lines were not modernized in the way emerging competitors would later adopt. Decisions about reinvestment were often delayed because shareholders expected returns in the present rather than promises of efficiency in the future. The same pride that powered racing success also created a belief that tradition was protection. It was not. The world after the Second World War changed rapidly. Britain emerged victorious in name but weakened financially. The government required that 70% of motorcycle production be exported to earn hard currency. That meant Norton could no longer rely only on racing prestige at home. It needed models that would appeal to American riders who had saved money during wartime and were ready to spend it. The legend had been built on refinement, but the modern world demanded reinvention. When Edward Turner's Triumph Speed twin proved that twin-cylinder engines could capture the American market, Norton faced a decision. It could continue refining its celebrated singles, or it could build a twin designed for export. The company chose to compete. Bert Hopwood, who had worked under Turner, was brought in to design a Norton twin that addressed the overheating and durability issues he had observed at Triumph. He reduced valve angles to shrink combustion chamber surface area and improve thermal efficiency. He rotated the rocker box layout to allow better cooling airflow across the head. He preserved a small bore and relatively long stroke to maintain mid-range torque that riders valued. These were careful choices rooted in engineering logic. They reflected the same mindset that had produced decades of racing success. Yet the broader industrial context was shifting. Japan and Germany, devastated during the war, rebuilt factories from the ground up with modern production lines. They were not bound by older tooling or informal manufacturing habits. In Britain, by contrast, many factories relied on established methods and resisted heavy reinvestment. investment. Management debates focused on short-term stability rather than long-term competitiveness. Norton still produced motorcycles that riders loved, but the gap between engineering excellence and industrial efficiency began to widen. That gap was not visible in a single race or a single sales year. It revealed itself slowly through small disadvantages that accumulated, a gearbox that felt dated, electrical systems that lacked refinement, production delays that frustrated dealers abroad. The motorcycles were still admired, but admiration alone could not compete with scale, cost control, and industrial modernization. Norton's strength remained its identity. The company understood how to build machines that felt alive beneath a rider. The small-bore long-stroke engines delivered torque without drama. The featherbed frame gave confidence in corners. Riders did not buy a Norton because it was the most powerful motorcycle available. They bought it because it carried history in its metal. That history became part of Britain's export story. American advertisements leaned on racing success and the aura of the Isle of Man. Norton was presented as authentic, tested, and proven. In the years immediately after the war, that message resonated. Veterans wanted machines that felt serious and purposeful. They wanted a piece of the same engineering that had dominated European circuits. However, pride can become a constraint. When internal warnings suggested that production needed modernization and that product ranges required expansion across multiple displacement categories, management hesitated. Investment in new tooling required capital. Capital was scarce. Shareholders demanded returns. The belief persisted that reputation would shield the company from disruption. Meanwhile, Japanese manufacturers studied production efficiency with the same intensity that Norton had once studied airflow. They built assembly lines designed for consistency and scale. They introduced overhead cam multi-cylinder engines that delivered smooth power and modern reliability. Norton's engineering culture remained thoughtful, but it was rooted in refinement of existing ideas rather than rapid diversification. A legend built on national pride now faced competitors who measured success not in trophies, but in units shipped and costs reduced. By the early 1950s, Norton still appeared strong. Racing victories continued. The featherbed frame stood as a benchmark. The twin engine offered export potential, yet beneath the surface, the company's structure was less stable than its public image suggested. The financial pressures that would later force ownership changes were already present in smaller forms. Reinvestment decisions were postponed. Industrial reforms were partial rather than comprehensive. Pride sustained morale, but it did not modernize factories. Norton had built an icon through discipline, engineering integrity, and national identity. The question was no longer whether it could win races. The question was whether it could adapt its legend to an economic system that rewarded scale and efficiency as much as heritage. When the Second World War ended, Britain stood on the winning side of history, but its balance sheet told a different story. The country had survived 2 global conflicts within a generation. Cities were damaged. Infrastructure was strained. Foreign reserves were thin. The government understood that recovery would depend on exports. Motorcycles, along with whiskey, were among the few goods Britain could produce and sell abroad quickly. A policy was introduced requiring that roughly 70% of motorcycle production be exported in order to earn hard currency. For Norton, this was not simply a commercial adjustment, it was a structural shift. The company could no longer focus only on satisfying domestic riders who already understood its racing heritage. It had to compete in markets where buyers judged motorcycles by price, reliability, and ease of ownership, rather than by trophies won on a windswept island in the Irish Sea. The American market became central to survival. During the war years, American consumers had little to buy, and savings accumulated. When peace returned, demand surged. Riders wanted machines that accelerated smoothly, sounded distinct, and felt modern. Triumph's Speed Twin had already demonstrated that a parallel twin could capture this appetite. Norton, famous for its singles, needed to respond. The company brought in Burt Hopwood to design a twin that would address overheating and durability issues he had seen elsewhere. He adjusted valve angles to reduce combustion chamber surface area and improve thermal efficiency. He reoriented the rocker boxes to allow cooling air to pass directly across the cylinder head fins. He retained a relatively small bore and longer stroke to preserve mid-range torque that riders actually used on public roads. These decisions reflected careful engineering thought rather than rushed imitation. Yet while engineers redesigned cylinder heads, the industrial foundations beneath them remained largely unchanged. Post-war Britain faced a deeper challenge than product design. Many factories still relied on informal production methods that had evolved over decades. Assembly lines were not reorganized with the precision that newer competitors would adopt. Investment in modern tooling required capital that companies did not always possess or were reluctant to allocate. Shareholders expected dividends. Management teams weighed immediate stability against long-term transformation. In this environment, Norton's careful twin design entered a world where cost control and production efficiency increasingly determined market share. The export requirement amplified pressure. Meeting overseas demand meant building at higher volumes, delivering on schedule, and maintaining consistent quality. These demands exposed weaknesses that racing victories could not conceal. Meanwhile, outside Britain, reconstruction took a different form. Germany and Japan, whose industries had been devastated, rebuilt factories from the ground up. In Japan especially, manufacturers adopted systematic production lines and invested heavily in process control. They studied efficiency with the same seriousness that Norton had once applied to airflow and combustion. By the late 1960s, Japanese companies were no longer limited to small displacement commuter bikes. Honda's CB750 demonstrated that high performance, reliability, and affordability could coexist. It offered overhead cam technology, smooth multi-cylinder power, and electric starting at a price many riders could justify. Norton's twins still carried character and torque, but they struggled to match the combination of performance and modern convenience. National pride had sustained the legend, but pride alone could not compete with scale and systematic manufacturing. The Commando, introduced in 1967, represented a final great assertion of Norton's engineering identity. Its isoelastic mounting system isolated engine vibration from the frame using rubber mounts, allowing the company to retain the familiar parallel twin layout while delivering a smoother ride. The Commando earned Machine of the Year honors multiple times and developed a devoted following. Riders appreciated its handling, shaped by lessons learned from the Featherbed era. The design balanced performance and feel rather than chasing outright horsepower numbers. Even as the Honda CB750 set new benchmarks, many enthusiasts believe the Commando offered a more authentic riding experience. Norton's marketing leaned into this distinction, presenting the motorcycle as both traditional and refined. However, beneath the acclaim, financial and organizational strains intensified. Norton had already experienced ownership changes earlier in its history. In 1953, it had been acquired by Associated Motorcycles after financial difficulties. AMC itself collapsed in 1966, leading to the formation of Norton Villiers. Later mergers produced Norton Villiers Triumph, an entity burdened by overlapping product lines, labor disputes, and complex management structures. Comparisons were drawn to British Leyland in the automotive sector, where multiple brands struggled under centralized control without sufficient modernization. Government support provided temporary relief but did not resolve structural inefficiencies. Decision-making slowed. Investment plans were debated rather than executed. The industry's center of gravity shifted eastward while British manufacturers debated consolidation. The Commando could win awards, but awards could not stabilize a balance sheet or modernize a supply chain. By the mid-1970s, the combined pressures proved overwhelming. Japanese manufacturers offered motorcycles that were not only powerful but also dependable and competitive priced. They produced at volumes that lowered costs and expanded dealer networks globally. British factories, including those tied to Norton, struggled with aging equipment and intermittent labor disruptions. Norton Villiers Triumph ultimately collapsed in 1976, marking the end of large-scale Norton motorcycle production in the United Kingdom. For many riders, the moment felt like more than a corporate failure. It felt like the fading of an era when British engineering set the pace. Yet the name Norton did not disappear. The brand carried emotional weight that extended beyond corporate structures. Even as production halted, the memory of Isle of Man victories and the image of the Commando persisted. That emotional capital would later attract investors who believed nostalgia could be transformed into renewed prosperity. The irony lay in the fact that the very heritage built on disciplined refinement and racing success would become a marketing asset long after the industrial base that supported it had weakened. The legend endured in memory, but the economic system that once sustained it had moved on. The collapse of NVT did not erase Norton's past. Instead, it created a vacuum in which the brand's identity floated free of consistent ownership. In the years that followed, the rights to the name changed hands several times. Each new steward promised restoration. Each revival attempt leaned heavily on history. The company that once symbolized national confidence now existed largely as an idea, powerful but detached from stable production. The contrast between racing glory and industrial fragility became sharper with time. Norton had proven it could refine an engine across decades. It had proven it could design frames that redefined handling. It had proven it could inspire loyalty. What it had not proven was that it could adapt its structure to the economic realities of late 20th century manufacturing. As the 1970s closed, the British motorcycle industry no longer dictated global trends. The machines that once exported national pride were replaced by imports that emphasized efficiency and reliability. Norton's struggle during this period was not simply a matter of outdated models. It was a reflection of management systems that hesitated to embrace structural change when warning signs first appeared. The legend was not undone by a single mistake. It was strained by a series of delayed decisions that accumulated over time. Watching Norton during these years felt less like witnessing a sudden fall and more like observing a proud institution trying to hold its posture while the ground beneath it shifted. After 1976, Norton no longer existed as a stable manufacturer. What survived was the name. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the rights to that name moved between owners who believed the badge still carried commercial power. Production attempts surfaced in small batches. Prototypes were unveiled. Promises were made about returns to glory. Each revival leaned heavily on racing memory and the cultural weight of the Isle of Man. The Featherbed frame and the Commando silhouette appeared in brochures and concept sketches. Nostalgia functioned as capital. Investors and enthusiasts were asked to believe that heritage alone could bridge decades of industrial decline. For some, that belief was sincere. For others, it was strategic. However, repeated relaunches without long-term stability weakened trust. Every failed revival shrank the pool of customers willing to place deposits in advance. Dealers hesitated. Suppliers demanded stronger guarantees. The brand's value shifted from proven manufacturing capability to symbolic heritage. Norton's mythology remained intact, but mythology does not build supply chains or manage cash flow. By the early 2000s, the company's greatest asset was emotional memory rather than industrial infrastructure. That imbalance set the stage for a new chapter built explicitly on the promise of restoration. When memory becomes the primary product, the line between revival and illusion grows thin. In 2008, businessman Stuart Garner acquired the Norton brand and announced an ambitious return to British production. His message resonated with enthusiasts who longed to see a national icon reborn on domestic soil. Models such as the Commando 961, the Dominator, and later the V4 SS were introduced with significant media attention. The designs balanced retro styling with modern components, signaling continuity with the past while suggesting contemporary performance. Government support and regional development funds reinforced the impression that Norton was not only a business, but a symbol of British manufacturing resilience. Marketing materials highlighted hand-built craftsmanship and limited production numbers. Heritage was not merely referenced. It was central to the pitch. Early excitement translated into pre-orders and deposits. Customers believed they were participating in the restoration of a historic mark. Investors viewed the brand's emotional appeal as a differentiator in a crowded market. However, operational challenges soon emerged. Production delays became common. Quality control complaints circulated among early buyers. After-sales support proved inconsistent. The company relied heavily on advance payments to fund ongoing operations. Instead of scaling methodically, it appeared to expand promises faster than manufacturing capability. The gap between narrative and execution widened as obligations accumulated. A celebrated name attracted faith, but faith cannot replace transparent accounting or disciplined management. Between 2012 and 2019, deeper problems developed behind the scenes. Pension schemes known as the Dominator, 2012, Commando 2012, and Donington MC funds encouraged individuals to invest retirement savings into the business. Participants were offered the prospect of strong returns tied to Norton's resurgence. In practice, millions of pounds were diverted or mismanaged. Investigations later revealed that funds had been used in ways unrelated to the stated purposes. By the time Norton entered administration, it was reported to hold approximately £14 million in debt. More than 200 pensioners faced significant losses. Legal proceedings followed, and Garner ultimately pleaded guilty to charges related to breaching pension regulations. He received a suspended prison sentence in 2021. The impact extended beyond financial loss. The scandal altered how the public perceived the brand. What had once symbolized racing courage and engineering integrity became associated with broken promises and regulatory failure. Employees who believed they were contributing to a proud revival found themselves uncertain about their future. Customers who had placed deposits questioned whether they would ever receive motorcycles. The collapse of Garner's Norton in 2020 felt less like a market correction and more like a moral fracture. Nostalgia, once used to attract support, now amplified disappointment. The same heritage that inspired investment also magnified the damage when trust collapsed. In 2020, Indian manufacturer TVS Motor Company purchased Norton for approximately £16 million. Reports indicated that around $100 million would be invested in rebuilding facilities, systems, and product development. The acquisition represented a shift from individual stewardship to corporate backing with established manufacturing experience. TVS committed to honoring certain outstanding customer obligations, including supplying motorcycles to deposit holders who had not received them under previous management. New leadership appointments aimed to professionalize operations and improve technical development. The narrative once again centered on restoration, but this time within a broader industrial framework. Despite these steps, financial losses continued in the short term. Reviving a brand after scandal requires capital and patience. Factories must be reorganized, compliance systems must be strengthened, products must meet evolving emission standards such as Euro 5 before entering wider markets. Norton's existing lineup, including the 961 and V4 models, faced intense competition from established premium manufacturers. Pricing remained high relative to performance metrics on paper. The strategy appeared to position Norton as a boutique, high-end marquee rather than a mass-market competitor. Success would depend on balancing exclusivity with credible engineering updates. Survival now depends not on memory alone, but on whether heritage can coexist with modern industrial discipline. For many observers, the question is no longer whether Norton deserves admiration for its past. That has been settled by decades of racing and innovation. The question is whether admiration can translate into sustainable demand in a global market shaped by efficiency, regulatory complexity, and technological acceleration. TVS offers resources that earlier owners lacked, yet resources alone do not guarantee cultural alignment or product relevance. New models must reflect contemporary expectations without reducing the brand to imitation. Investment must prioritize manufacturing robustness rather than spectacle. Watching Norton across these eras feels like observing a proud institution learning repeatedly that sentiment cannot substitute for structure. The early decades showed how disciplined engineering could create legend. The post-war years revealed how industrial hesitation could erode advantage. The Garner period demonstrated how nostalgia can be leveraged in ways that outpace governance. The current chapter under TVS remains unfinished. It represents another attempt to reconcile national heritage with global economics. The company's future will depend on whether lessons from previous collapses are internalized rather than romanticized. An icon can inspire generations, but only disciplined management allows it to endure beyond memory.